It was 10 a.m., Monday, the 19th of January, 2015, when I walked onto the playground of the Langata Road Primary School. 800 students, about 10, 15 teachers, and a few parents, and a couple of activists who had strayed onto this land that had been grabbed by a very famous politician. At 4 p.m., I was guest of the state, and I was at the Kilimani police station, and I had been arrested. 2 years later, I found myself again the guest of the state. This time I was at a ceremony where the Minister of Lands was giving out 1,000 title deeds to primary schools from across the Republic. Those 26 months were a lifetime. And I learned one of the most important things about our work. In order to build bridges, sometimes you have to knock down some walls. My clicker's not working, so you're missing the visuals. Oh, here we go. One of the most important things to realize about walls is that the most biggest, strongest walls actually don't exist between people, but they exist in our own minds. Let me turn a little bit to the context that we both find ourselves, whether we're working in Europe or in Africa, as important. For many of us, we know that context is decisive. We also know that context is changing very fast. And that whether we live in Europe or whether we live in Africa, this context defines our work. We see growing uncertainty, fear even, polarization between and within societies, both in Europe and Africa. And in Africa also we see some opportunities. Like, for example, we are increasingly becoming more differentiated. We are a very globalized economy. Increasingly, our capital markets are beginning to look more robust. We are also seeing the rising returns from real estate investment. And all of that makes it very possible for us to think of a different future from one that was essentially defined by development finance and overseas or official development assistance. We now have some options. I'd like to share with you, just to kick off the conversation, 5 choices that we could make. The first is that if we are able to find ways of generating common interest around common problems, we may have some common investment opportunities. Secondly, if we can build local constituencies for change, constituencies that are not dependent on external funding flows, but are primarily resourceful and resourced from within, then we have the potential for social movements for change on any matter that really we think is important. In the aftermath of the Langata Road Primary School, I got a phone call from the head of CEDA Sweden. And he said, Irungu, did we pay for that reclamation of that primary school and all the drama that went on with it? And I said, well, technically you did. But actually, if I was to tell you how much it cost us about 10,000 shillings, less than $100. And out of that one action came no less than 25 public actions across the country where communities went into their schools, either knocked down walls or reclaimed primary playgrounds that had been grabbed by thieves and land grabbers. So a movement can emerge from very little resources. The third issue, and this is one where we struggle with a little bit, too used to the idea of Africa as a basket case, we forget that actually we do produce states, and that those states are presiding over some of the fastest growing economies, not just in Africa, but also across the world. We have to keep the African state primarily responsible for bearing the duty of providing services, an enabling environment, and an economy that works not just for some, but for all. If we do not do that, then we, as philanthropists, are short-circuiting the democracy that is required to produce healthy and firm societies. So we have to place the state at the center. But more importantly, we have to create the environment and the domestic demand for the state to do what it needs to do. So by funding agile, adaptive, and self-reliant organizations, we have the capacity to build the grounds that will be required for a responsive governance system. And if we can build and support a growing African leadership that has an appetite for shifting the power, then we have the capacity to produce the conditions on which Africa can lend something to the rest of the world rather than requesting. So I'd like to leave you with this thought that solidarity is possible. We can build bridges, but they have to be new kind of bridges. And they have to involve knocking down some walls. Not just the walls that trespass on our public spaces, but the walls that exist within our mindsets. Thank you.
Here today, I'm representing a solidarity of women. And I represent solidarity of women in my country, Mongolia, in our Asian region, and internationally. And I want to start with this painting. Is it there? Okay, thank you. I want to share the story behind this painting. This painting is embodiment of our cause, a woman. But also it is an embodiment of our solidarity, because this portrait was painted by over 100 women activists in Mongolia, starting from the women leaders of very grassroots small groups to the top-notch women's rights advocates who fight in parliament. So this is embodiment of our movement, which is not always as well painted and solid as this picture or this portrait. It is a hard work. So, as a representative of Mongolian Women's Fund, I firmly testify that philanthropy fosters and supports solidarity. We saw how a small funding created a nationwide campaign in 2016 when women activists, women in decision-making positions in government, in public services, almost 1,000 women came together and defended our law against domestic violence in 2016 when new parliament came into power and revoked it. We stood united, we stood in solidarity, and we defended our law. And ever since, we stay alert, so it doesn't happen again. However, it is just one side of the story to say that philanthropy fosters and supports solidarity. It is just one side. I want to share with you another side. In Mongolia, we saw how solidarity fosters, supports, builds, strengthens philanthropy. A small group of women in winter of 2016 created a small movement to protest against air pollution in Ulaanbaatar, our capital city. A year after, or last January in 2016, this movement grew so much bigger. And it included donors, it included local foundations, it included corporations that donated their time, money, resources to organize a much bigger and much stronger protest. I was there, and as I said, it happened in January 2016, and it happened that on that very day, the weather was minus 35 degrees Celsius, yes. So when I arrived there, in 30 minutes, I felt like I got scared. I thought I will not be able to stand till the end of the protest. And then I saw an elderly woman walking around with 2 pots of hot tea and distributing small cups and pouring this tea to people so they could stay warm and finish the march. So I had a cup of hot tea. Later, two young men wearing a logo of a wealthy corporation, they were distributing hot tea too. So I'm happy to say that I was able to stay until the end, and I was able to join the protest. Not just me, but everybody was there. So we saw how in Mongolia, solidarity fostered philanthropy. But today here, I also represent an international movement of women's funds, Prospera. We are 38 women's funds that work together in solidarity. And we mobilize resources internationally and locally for the advancements of the rights of girls, women, trans people. Just in 2016, together we raised $66 million and distributed it to 1,800 groups in all continents: Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia. In fact, we have our European women's funds here in this room today. So I stand in solidarity with them. So, as a representative of Women's Fund, of this transnational movement of women's funds, I firmly testify that solidarity creates and fosters philanthropy. But our philanthropy is political, because it is about changing the system of oppression, inequality, exclusion, and our resources are mobilized and distributed for building social justice. So I disagree that philanthropy supports or fosters and creates solidarity. My argument is that our solidarity that was there for almost 200 years actually fosters and supports philanthropy. However, I don't want to say here today what is more important, philanthropy or solidarity, because today in this space when we see that space for civil societies are closing so rapidly and so rigidly, that we are so intertwined that we need to stay together. So it is not about solidarity or philanthropy, it is about our work together. So we have our transnational movement of women's funds is painting another portrait of a woman. And we have plenty of space for you to join. So I hope you will.
Let me start first by expressing my solidarity with the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, also the Black Lives Matter in North America, also the civilization campaign that we heard of yesterday in Hungary to defend the civil society, and equally importantly, with my friend Brendan Cox and the values and the ideals for which Joe Cox lived and died. I come from a context which I think is a fairly universal context, but it's a context where a person called Pehlu Khan, and as the name suggests, he comes from Islam, was lynched by vigilante groups just a month ago. And this is the second time that's happened in just few months in India. This is also the context which I come from, where people are still doing head loading of shit, literally head loading of shit to clean toilets. So from that context, I actually want to problematize the whole idea of solidarity and actually throw three fundamental tensions and then try and see what philanthropy does. The first is, and we've heard about few of these things, but I just want to amplify them. I think there's much greater emphasis needed if we are talking of solidarity. I don't know how many of you have been to Mumbai, and you've been to Mumbai, and if you've driven from Mumbai airport to the town, there's this 40-floor building. Unfortunately, it's also aesthetically very grotesque, but it's the most expensive house in the world. And trust me, within a kilometer of that, there are 200 to 300,000 people living in informal settlements. That's the kind of inequality we're looking at. The Oxfam report has been constantly talking about the growing inequality. This year, 8 people on this planet have more wealth than 50% of the global population, which is more than 3.5 billion people. And again, in the last 5 years, it was around few hundred people. From there, it's come down to 8 people. So until and unless we start looking at the fundamental tension between this neoliberal political economic model, which actually breeds inequality, and on the other hand, talking about solidarity, I don't think we'll make much headway. We need to resolve this tension and attack this tension. The second, I think democracy as an ideal, somebody spoke about end of history, and liberal democracy was seen as the solution. But what we've seen is electoral democracies, representative democracies. And we've really not seen substantive democracy. And now what you see is oligarchies and crony capitalism around the world. And that reflects in the narrative of anger, whether it was the Arab Spring, whether it's the Occupy movement, or the anti-rape protests in my country. So what you're seeing is a process of election which actually divides. For political leaders, it's important to divide, to be able to get the votes that you're looking for. So again, democracy as a value is very, very critical for us, but the electoral forms of democracy, the representative forms of democracy, I think, again, creates a fundamental tension with the idea of solidarity. The third fundamental tension, and Irangu has talked about it, I think we're getting all very concerned, and rightly so, about the walls being created, visible walls. But I think we've always had invisible walls. You have deeply entrenched hierarchies of race, caste, gender, patriarchy, and so on. Till we start addressing questions of indignity, injustice, can you really make solidarity sit with the context of, say, an apartheid South Africa? Unlikely. So let's start addressing these very, very fundamental questions of injustice, and then only when you start teasing out these questions can you start looking at substantive, real solidarity. So in these fundamental 3 tensions, I just wanted to then put the spotlight back on us. As philanthropy, what have we done? Are we really part of the solution? Or can we be candid and also start looking at, are we part of the problem? I feel very anxious when Seattle, and I'm sure everybody understands what I'm saying, when Seattle decides what would be the developmental intervention in my small village. And that's what philanthropies have done. Taken away the agency from the local and increasingly given it to Seattle. In terms of the fundamental question of power redistribution, what's been the role of philanthropies? I think that's really the critical question. By giving resources, have we taken people away from their own communities? By giving lock frames, have we taken people away from where they would have been raging at the barricade and making them sit on their laptops filling forms? These are tough questions, but if we don't ask these questions even now, I don't think we'll be moving towards solidarity. I just wanted to end with 2 thoughts. One, I do strongly believe that solidarities happen around values. And that's where I just want to show this slide. Gandhi visiting England. And I find this inspirational. These are mill workers somewhere outside London expressing solidarity with Gandhi, who was there to challenge the British Empire. That's the kind of solidarity which was about justice, which was about human dignity. Just to end, there's this, I'll end with a very brief story. Many of you would know about it, but this is a story from Gautam Buddha. When he was a young prince, his cousin actually hunted a bird And Gautam Buddha immediately picked the bird, nursed it, but by then the cousin came and said, "This bird is mine." So both of them started fighting. Gautam Buddha said, "I've nursed him. I've brought the bird back to life. So I should really decide what the bird would be doing." Whereas the cousin said, "I hunted it down. It's mine." Both of them decided to go to the king to get the king's verdict. I think the jury is still out, but I think philanthropists need to decide on which side are they on. Thank you.
Good morning. What you're looking at is a photograph that was taken by a junior high school student that's titled "Circle of Friends." The student emphasized the need for this picture basically to demonstrate that even in a town where things are still racially divided, there is a circle of friends. This circle of friends sees themselves in the bright future for each other and for their communities. So this photograph is a constant reminder of why the work of the Black Belt Community Foundation is an essential necessity in Alabama. The Black Belt Community Foundation is located in Selma, the city in the United States where much of the world credits it for having changed the world, not just a nation, but because of an entire world. It was affected by the Civil Rights Movement of 1965. But for several centuries, there's been a constant struggle of power within our communities. And at the Black Belt Community Foundation, we are working to shift the power through philanthropy. So to prove that people can live peaceably with each other, they can build, they can grow, and they can transform communities with each other, if provided that civil space. So solidarity in Selma and the Alabama Black Belt is community working together to address these issues in partnership with academic, religious, and business communities. Solidarity is community taking leadership and ownership in creating solutions for community problems. In 2002, the Birmingham, Alabama News did a series of articles titled "The Black Belt, Alabama's Third World Country." So for 9 weeks, images of Alabama's Black Belt, some of the worst images, were shared across not only the city of Birmingham, the state of Alabama, but the nation and in some other countries throughout the world. While each image was factual in its presentation, it was the most biased demonstration of a place that others know as a place that changed the world and the place that I call home. So communities taking ownership of community problems looks like the Black Belt Community Foundation partnering with a local institution to create a program called Black Belt 100 Lenses, which gave students in the 7th through the 12th grade point-and-shoot cameras to go out and document their culture. Now, this may sound like a very, very small project, but what happened is you got to see the good and the not so good of what was present in a region, and not just a one-sided view of what the region looked like. This particular project brought together communities. It brought together parents, it brought together students, and it brought together communities to help transform the region. So what was valuable about this is in Selma, Alabama, and in the Black Belt, there are still communities that are equally racially divided, still divided by socioeconomic status, but this particular project brought together students and parents who otherwise were not communicating with each other to come together to affect change in their community. One other picture that came together from this project was a student who noticed a pothole in the middle of a road in their community. And this student in the 7th grade went along with parents and others to their county commission, their local government, to actually have this project fixed. It sounds very, very small, but it was transformative in itself because individuals came together. Solidarity took place over a value, over an issue that was relevant to that community. Other times, parents are coming together to work with those particular students in an entrepreneurial way to create a coffee book that will eventually be sold and note cards that will be sold to support this type of program, coming together based on the values that are important to them. So there is indeed a role that philanthropy can play in building solidarity among our communities. It must be bold. It must take risks. It must not be afraid to take risks. After all, to fly is to risk falling. So if we're afraid to fall, we indeed will never, ever fly. As I think back to 1965 with the civil rights movement, if organizers had approached traditional funding sources for support to organize, perhaps I wouldn't have the right to vote today because it looked different. But communities came together, and we saw a change that not only affected the state of Alabama or North America, but we saw a change that affected the world. So it says that we must be bold in our work and not afraid to take risks, because we never know what we do may actually be life-changing. At the end of the day, if philanthropy is to really embrace and illustrate solidarity and transformation, we have an opportunity to create lasting change by working with communities. I want to share that one particular project that the foundation has worked really well to do is to partner with local community leaders called our Community Associates. It's a grassroots leadership program where our goal is to equip them with the right tools to go out and band together to transform this region that we call home. So the greatest gift has come through this particular group of individuals who we work really hard to give them the tools they need so that they can affect change. We try to work with them to provide tools of advocacy, communication, data assessment and evaluation, all of those so they could do well. It was once said that I can win any battle if I'm given the right ammunition. So our goal is to provide the necessary tools so that we can then see solidarity and impactful change throughout our region. I would be remiss if I wouldn't share that a dear friend of mine once shared an African proverb that says, to do something with us to do something for us instead of with us does nothing for us at all. So I say to philanthropy, as we discuss solidarity and our role in it, we have an awesome task upon us and a wonderful opportunity to really do something with community to affect positive and lasting change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody. I'm Jenny Hodgson. I'm Executive Director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and I'd like to invite our four speakers back up to the stage for a bit of a conversation. So they weren't introduced before by design, but Irungu Houghton from the Kilimani Project Foundation in Kenya. Balor Legjim from MONES, the Mongolian Women's Fund. Amitabh Beha from the National Foundation for India. And Felicia Lucky from the Black Belt Community Foundation in Selma, Alabama. Now, we don't have a lot of time for this closing session, so what we wanted to do was to open up this question a little bit to you. If we're going to talk about solidarity, we want to talk about people thinking and acting together. So I wonder if you could put the slide up. A lot of what you've heard has been around philanthropy, solidarity, and power. So just by a show of hands, I would like you to show me whether you agree with this statement or not. If philanthropy is serious about building solidarity, it must give away some of its own power. If you agree with that, raise your hands. If you disagree with that, feel free to raise your hands. Smart group. So I'm going to turn for a little conversation with our panelists, but I want you to think about this next part of it, where we would like to model some solidarity. So if you could add the other part of the slide, and the other part. I'm going to welcome a few of you to join us on the stage, demonstrating solidarity, by being part of this conversation. We've brought a global conversation to Europe, but it's not just a show and tell and for you to be interested and go, oh, that was good. We want to sort of start actually trying see if we can connect some of these dots. So I'm going to invite two sets of comments, very brief, please, because part of solidarity, I think, is about sharing power and giving voice to as many people as possible. So if you think, yes, solidarity, philanthropy can build solidarity and it can give away power like this, please stand here. And if you want to go, it's not as straightforward as that, so I'm not saying no, but actually to problematize it a little bit, just plan to organize yourselves there. So I'm going to start talking to our friends here, but feel free to stand up and just park yourselves there, and as soon as I see people there, you'll be welcomed on. And please, somebody do this, because otherwise it's going to look really silly at the end. But so yeah, feel free to stand and don't feel self-conscious. You are welcome. We are welcoming you to join us in solidarity for this conversation. But I want to start with you, Amitabh. I think a big theme of this conversation here over the last couple of days is the assumption that philanthropy is a force for good, and philanthropy can be part of solidarity. Now, that's an assumption based on the European Foundation Centre has members, and you're all kind of embedded in, I can see you, this side please as well. The assumption that philanthropy can and should be an actor for social justice. But in countries like India, that assumption can't be made. Actually, philanthropy and civil society don't necessarily sit comfortably with each other. Last year I was at a session organized by Civicus in Bogota, and I asked people to tell me what they think. So a civil society organization, what do you think of when you think of philanthropy? And one young woman from East Africa put up her hand and she said, philanthropy is two things. Philanthropy is love of mankind and womankind. Philanthropy is also a tool of elites to entrench their interests and have influence in politics. Now, those are pretty different views. So can you talk a bit about the context in India, why philanthropy we can't necessarily assume can be a force for good, and in some cases might not be a force for good at all?
Okay, so this is certainly not a planted question or a response, but let me start by saying we need to relook at how we define philanthropy. Very often philanthropy is seen traditionally in terms of people with huge wealth, right, giving up those resources, not giving up a small fraction of that for some social goods. Right. However, what I would say is that we also need to look at community philanthropies. That's why I said it's not a planted question. So community philanthropies where people give out of solidarity. Right. So whether it could be really in terms of grains for the activists to live through the day, or small few rupees that will strengthen the movement. So I think one, that's something that needs to be clearly articulated. The second, which is very critical, particularly in the context of say India, and I think many other, certainly southern countries, where the rule of law is not strong, businesses feel extremely anxious in actually supporting social justice causes, because the repression from the state can completely damage and hurt the businesses also. Right. And very often the second part, and I'll be brief, so very often the money is also not made through fair and just causes. So philanthropy divorced from responsible businesses is something what we see very often. As in, can you really look at an extractive supporting a displacement, anti-displacement movement? So those questions, businesses, the way the money is made, to just to end, you come to India and speak to activists, they would probably see every penny as blood money. Right. And I would not take that with significant cynicism.
Right, so the idea of philanthropy and progressive philanthropy. So the role, this kind of platform just isn't there yet in somewhere like India right now. It's still, the philanthropy conversation is a very small and marginal one, I guess. And Beloy, your comment about actually solidarity grows philanthropy. If you can connect people to each other, then the giving, the organizing, the asset mobilization comes as a byproduct of solidarity. Do you want to just say a word about that? And then I'm going to come to our first person, about 30-second interjections from this side and this side, okay? You ready?
As a post-socialist country, we don't have the old money. All the money are new, so the philanthropy that people very heavily rely on, especially in our cause, are community philanthropy. And that's where we go for support. And every penny we raise from people, from communities, every one of them comes with commitment. It is not just a penny, it is commitment. So we go very, very strongly after this money. But at the same time, we also foster the culture of philanthropy, especially among corporations, because it is their responsibility and their duty. And I totally agree with Amitabh saying that not all the money are equal. And for the social causes that we choose, we make distinction between where this money come from. So it is not just about raising money, it is about raising money that can contribute to social justice.
Right, and I think that's been a theme that's come up this last couple of days about the vulnerability of organizations that rely on just large chunks of money without local constituency, that if that money is pulled for whatever reason, often there's not much left behind, that communities are saying, where's our organization, bring it back, because the lack of embeddedness of organizations that don't have constituencies. Okay, sir, if you want to come up and introduce yourself and give your...
I just thought I can't speak, but I can speak as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, and
Kuba Golewski, I come from a Polish foundation. I just start very, very briefly, like where money sits, it's part of a historical process. It's not a coincidence that the biggest foundations are in the richest country, and this money was made in a certain way. Also, the way you draft programs and the way you set programs is elected through these foundations that sit in certain places. So I think that's already in the way philanthropy works and where it's based, but the agenda is set. And it's a very big ask to open up those agendas and setting of sources to people who are actually receiving them, but not just the part what you decide to fund, but where this money comes from and how it's managed. So I would stop here because I think it's a big topic already.
great, thank you. And let's have one from this side. Vesna, are you going to go first?
Hi, I'm Vesna Agic from Mosaic Foundation from Sarajevo, and I'm on this side. So someone once said that I don't believe in charity, but I believe in solidarity, because charity it's vertical and solidarity it's horizontal. And then when it's horizontal, then yes, we have to share power, not to give it away. Because if power is seen as a circle, and then there is as a pie, and then you cut off one part and give it away, you feel like you are losing something. And I would rather see a solidarity and power as a circle that grows through sharing. So we should be empowering others and making circle of power bigger.
Lovely, yes, very nice. Felicia, can I turn to you? You come from a community foundation where most of the money is old white wealth. Now, there are a number of foundations that have that asset or that problem, according to how you see it. And yet your foundation is actually funding very sort of cutting-edge issues around race and justice because of some of the work that you've done, which is to take that money which might not naturally be affiliated to the kinds of things you're doing. Can you talk about what was the first step that was taken within the foundation to move that sort of old white wealth into something that was really quite political and edgy?
Most definitely. And I'll say that we still don't have it all down pat yet, but we have made some progress along the way. We're a 13-year-old foundation that was really created out of the need to serve a population that had not been previously served before. It was not started with a huge drop of funds to build a strong endowment. We had to really work to build it from within the local communities, and then from there, leverage the investment from the old white money that was previously there and partner it with the money that we had raised. That's been pretty much the mantra of how we've worked, by working in community to, number one, say this is what community wants and what community deems as a necessity, and then we pull in the dollars that community has raised, partner with the older money or money that is coming from more traditional sources to actually affect the change that we're working with. It has taken a lot of work. It is not easy work to do because you've got to be in the communities and in those spaces to actually hear and know what community is asking for. If you aren't there, then you're just building something for them that they may or may not want. So it's been challenging to do, but a very necessary thing for us to do. And I think we've been able to take those dollars in there to help share that we need equity in the way our organizations operate, in the way our political structure is established, and helping to use those volunteers we have to actually level the playing field. So oftentimes we use equity and equality interchangeably, but for us in the area and room, we talked about equality is kind of each person having a shoe, and equity is really everyone having a shoe that fits them. So being able to build that within the Black Belt region is something that's very, very critical for us.
Right, right. And if you're thinking kind of an ecosystem view, what you've done is really built this sort of embedded network of people who are advocates for the foundation, and they not only identify where there are opportunities to be supported, but they've actually started mobilizing relatively small amounts of money, but symbolically quite important. Can you want to say a word about that?
I would. I think that's one of the pieces that sets us apart from most traditional foundations is that we have a group of volunteers that I spoke about earlier, which are our community associates, and there are maybe around 120 of these individuals who believe very strongly in the work that we're doing. They're not your traditional believers who have tons and tons of money, but they give very generously. They invest in what they think is going to work well, and they're willing to use their time, talents, and treasure for the sake of building this organization. That's monumental to us because we believe that if we're going to build lasting change within the community has to be an integral part of it. They have to own it. And so this is their piece of ownership that they've invested into the organization by their time, talent, and treasure, which are equally valuable to us, not just as much the gift of the dollar, but also the time and talent that they give.
So you're sort of starting to blend that kind of vertical resource and that horizontal resource and putting equal emphasis on the two of them.
Right, and I do want to share that we have had one challenge as we've worked to identify board members. We're able to actually build a very diverse board, but as we work to build our community associates, which are our grassroots leaders, it is not as diverse, and that's a very big challenge for us. And I think most times because to have an African-American-led organization in the States for us is something that is somewhat of an anomaly. We've not always had those. So we've seen that we've been able to bring both blacks and whites and other colors together at the board level, but not equally as so at the community grassroots level. And that's something that we're working at. And we're trying to really work at that to help break the tradition because that's been the norm or the pattern that's existed over the last few years.
Right, okay, from this side. Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lentfer. I'm from Thousand Currents. I think one of the things that has plagued philanthropy since its inception has been this assumption of neutrality, when in fact there are massive personal and institutional barriers to sharing power. One of the ways that we can do that very easily is core support, operating support, no strings attached, unrestricted support. It's possible. Let's do it, everybody.
Thank you. Irungo, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to come back to this side. The stories of donor interventions where they've had an impact on the kinds of organizations that have emerged. I mean, this is not a new story to Africa. This has been the story of the last 50 years, where you have civil society organizations who when they are externally funded, see their main constituency as their donors and their communities as their clients. How does, in your view, what is the gap that philanthropy can help to start to kind of grow that shifts the locus down towards relevance to communities, and the role of sort of resources, whether it's resources for high net worth individuals because they are everywhere in the world, as well as communities? Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think the first thing that I challenge a little bit is the idea of giving away power. And I think the great point made here really is that if we start off with power as a finite concept, then actually that's what happens. You have to give some of it away for others to get some. But if we think about leveraging power, then it becomes interesting. I think the starting point for many of us, and I think the relationship, the kind of 400-year relationship between Europe and Africa really is based on a colonial model. And it's largely, we're all doing this work on the back of an extractive economic model that ensures that African resources essentially benefit everybody first and then Africa. And I think what we're beginning to recognize is basically what we have is a Band-Aid solution, right? So I think the interesting conversation for me now is really thinking about, how could we create solidarity mechanisms around co-investment, around, asset development for organizations. And I think that's our relationship. Internally, within our societies, what's becoming much more possible now is actually having different kind of conversations. So the Kilimani Project Foundation works in a community, it's about 42,000 people in one of the suburbs of Nairobi. And when we started the foundation, the first question is middle-class people don't need a community foundation. Somebody agrees with me, I think. Middle-class people don't need a community foundation. Community foundation is what low-income and poor people need. And then we pointed out that actually probably about 80% of disposable income by middle-class families is actually being used to take middle-class, I guess what you'd call public needs, or needs that are actually public issues, into a private space. So they spend a lot of money on private education. Whenever the electricity goes out, they put out a new generator. They put up lots of security around their houses when they could actually invest in the local police station. And one of the things that became very clear to us was that if we got the public system to work, actually middle-class private solutions would not be necessary. So that's the conversation we're now having with the middle class in this area in which we work. And then the other lie is that this is only a middle-class suburb.
Right.
Probably unlike many of you here, many middle-class suburbs in the south have a large number of low-income people who come in either as domestic workers or as security officers or as gardeners, and we do not actually see them as part of the community. So the other big challenge for those of us working domestically is actually how do you create inclusive neighborhoods? How do you create inclusive societies? And if we think about the rate of urbanization coming in Africa and the number of young people, we are probably on the verge of being one of the youngest continents in the world. If not in the next 20 years, it will be the case. And we're probably going to have the most number of people in urban cities, comparable only perhaps to some of the Asian cities. So I think this is something for us that we need to crack. And maybe in cracking it, we can offer something to Europe as well.
Could you just tell the toilet story?
Haha. So there's a mall. Those of you who know Nairobi, we are mall crazy. We're opening up malls faster than schools. And there's one particular mall, and I had a chance to speak to the director. I had actually gone out. The foundation is funded largely through kind of membership as well. So we have both businesses and individual residents. And I went up, and I was on a membership grab moment. And I went up to the Prestige Plaza, the owner of Prestige Plaza, and I said to him, what is your contribution to the community? I'm thinking that there would be a bit of an awkward silence, and then at that point I could pull out a membership form and hand it to him. And he says, well, actually, we offer services to the community. So I said, what community, what services are these? He says, well, there's something like 1,400 flushes that happen in our public toilets every day. So I kind of let that one sink, because I knew there was a moment there. I need to kind of get out of my go-get-a-member mindset, and just listen. And what he explained was that from the urban, dense suburbs and neighborhoods of Kibera to the Kilimani area, there is an army, and I'll call them an army, of young people, particularly men and women, who walk across to basically provide services to the people in the Kilimani area. And between their home and the homes that they work, there is no public toilet. So this mall has people going in the whole time. In the morning, and there's actually there's a peak traffic moment. So in case you're in Nairobi and you need to use the toilet in the Prestige Plaza, I suggest don't go between 6 a.m. and about 8 a.m. Any other time, it's fine.
Let no one say you don't learn something at these conferences.
Yeah, this is all useful, very useful. So I began thinking, actually, this is kind of interesting. So there are different ways in which private capital, local business, can offer services in ways that we don't think imaginable, right? So the very first thing we did the next time was the Kilibani Project Foundation produced a memorandum to the county government, and one of the things we pushed for was for a public toilet. Not because we don't like the prestige toilets, but we thought it kind of is a public good that people should have a place to do what they need to do.
We've got somebody from this side. Yes, do you want to introduce yourself? Thanks.
Hello, my name is Franz Brüller. I work for the Erste Foundation in Austria. For me, power equals responsibility. And okay, you can give away your responsibility, but I think you can also use your responsibility. And responsibility for me has the connotation of being able to answer, responsibility, to answer to those who expect that I use the power that I have as a philanthropic organization to the best of society. And I think, therefore, it would be difficult to give up that power, but I think we should be held to answer for what we do with it. And I think that's, as you said it about public administration, needs to answer for shortcomings. I think we need to answer for what we are about to do, what we are doing, to those with whom and for whom we are doing it. And I fully agree with you that, and that goes back to the sharing that Vesna mentioned, it's not doing something for, but doing something with others. So include others in your power, answer for that power, but don't necessarily give it away.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. You're suggesting a kind of linked up approach where everyone uses the powers that they have to the best of their ability, and that's fine if it just sometimes doesn't happen with foundations when it comes to applying for their grants or how they make their decisions or what they request, and sometimes this disconnect between that theory and the culture of an institution, unless we keep talking about it, becomes an issue. Let me go to this side for one more comment from this side, and then I'm going to come back to you, Balor, with a question.
Hi, thanks. I do agree that power doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but some fabulous feminist academic once said that you're not going to dismantle the master's house with his own tools, and I do think that the way that we model our organisations, if they are hierarchical and unequal, we're not going to tackle the questions and the challenges that Amitav raised so well in his speech. Thanks.
Thank you. Not just say who you are.
Oh, sorry. Rose Longhurst from the Edge Fund, and we just had a fabulous session about participatory grant making, which is very similar to the community foundation sort of model about building power in a larger community. Thanks.
Thank you. Balor, could you tell us how in the work of Monez you try and sort of address issues of power? I mean, Mongolia is as I understand, it's sort of China's backyard for every single resource under the sun right now. And so you've got some clearly power dynamics at a sort of national, international level. But actually having that conversation where you're taking a country that has been quite sort of isolated from the rest of the world to introduce this idea of kind of modern philanthropy, social justice philanthropy. What does that look like in a day-to-day way for you?
Yes. International, we are becoming more and more dependent on China's economy. For instance, if Chinese economy decides that it wants to switch to solar power or to renewable energy, we are immediately, next day, we are feeling it in our country. If Russia decides that oil prices should go up, we feel it the next day, and maybe like 2 hours later. So our corporations and foundations are very much dependent on our neighbors. And in this environment, we have to figure out the way where it is not about the economy, it is about people's idea what is social justice. So we have to go out there and inform people or share with people what is social justice with or without foreign investment. Even if there is extractive industry is taking over. And what is then social justice in a mining place where, yes, it's true, the GDP is going up, but does it really translate into the well-being of women in this neighborhood or this exact industry destroys this woman's livelihood. So it is not just about sharing, what is philanthropy or why you should contribute, but it is about, at the same time, we always have to go and discuss what is social justice, what people think is social justice. So every time we raise a conversation or we conduct a fundraising event or campaign, it is more about the cause rather than the outcome in terms of the money. So that's why as I said earlier, every dollar that we raise, or every tugrik, which is our national currency, is as important to us as maybe $1,000 raised from abroad.
Yeah, in terms of trust and what it represents beyond just the money. I want you just to, this is a group of European foundations. This is an organized sector. This is philanthropy in one of its best iterations, she says very flatteringly to the group. I'd like you to, when we come to close, just to be able to give some sort of suggestions to European philanthropy who's come to Warsaw to talk about solidarity. So there's an invitation, it seems to me, to start thinking about what this looks like beyond. To think of some final comments for this group, for this room of European foundations, some who work internationally, some regionally, some nationally, to think about how we can connect, or some advice about how they can be thinking about their work. I'm going to take the last two comments from our patient people sitting on the steps there. Oh, you can add unoriginal is good too. We all do that.
So, hello everyone, my name is Vineet Rishi, I'm from the Oak Foundation. I was just saying I didn't have anything original to add. I think power is about how it's exercised, so what you're describing is a certain exercise of power. I think power is inherent, power structures are inherent. It's not about giving it away, it's about using it well.
Thank you, great. And we'll have one more from, it's just one of you still there, yes. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Ivan. I work for the Latsis Foundation based in Greece and the Guerrilla Foundation based in Germany. I just wanted to add the philanthropy, I think, needs a systems thinking approach. I think a lot of people in this room are incredibly culpable in terms of where their assets go, and they are actually perpetuating and investing in corporations and businesses that then their philanthropy is being used to tackle, which is a bit of a paradox, I think. And another issue that I just want to touch on is spending down, and accumulation of resources is part of the problem and part of this market fundamentalist system. So I think spending down is an issue that we need to be discussing more and more, as opposed to accumulating vast amounts of resources and talking about endowment building as opposed to transparent and ethical investing. Africa, I'm constantly reading articles that Africa is getting 160 billion in aid, but there's 200 billion coming out of Africa because of tax havens and wealth havens and tax dodges. So I think we need to be looking at what systems we're perpetuating and looking at them from a systems thinking approach. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So obviously that touches on the invest divest, so you're looking at your money without the context of where it comes from when it could be part of the problem in a particular context. And I think the asset accumulation thing is interesting because I would say, being based in Africa, that the lack of accumulation of assets is the vulnerability of civil society. So I think it's the downsizing of some assets and the upsizing of other assets, the assumption that if you're an NGO, you are successful because you spent every last penny of your grant and you end your year on zero is clearly not advice you would give perhaps to your child leaving home for the first time. So I think maybe some of taking these ideas and putting them together. So just in the last few seconds, because I see we've got approximately 45 seconds, but I'm sure Gonzaga will give us a minute each. Some thoughts, reflections on this conversation. Let's start with you, Felicia.
I'd close by reiterating what was said earlier, just that to encourage us to be bold in how we do our work, and if it doesn't fit inside of a box, not to scratch it off the list. I think sometimes it just requires a little more creativity. It's once said that if you're looking for an excuse, anyone will do. So if you're looking for an excuse not to fund something or not to support something that looks different than what you traditionally know, you can easily create one. Equally so, if you're looking for a reason to do it, it can be just as easy to do.
Great, thank you. Amitabh, your closing thoughts.
I'm very glad that the conversation has moved to power. And as Rose very rightly said, yes, power is not a zero-sum game. However, I think we also need to look at, are we exercising power with humility? Are we exercising power with a sense of history, of colonialism, of imperialism? I think that's critical. So as philanthropists, I would say that if we are really looking at each project from the lens of the question that are we redistributing power from the old privileges to people who don't have power, by building power of the community, I think we're on the right track.
Right. So the point that also European values, if you're sitting in Africa or in India, may look a little different from if you're not, let's say. Bolo, any closing thoughts?
Thank you. This is a great opportunity because this is something that we constantly discuss and battle with. The women's rights-based approach is not about giving the money and telling them what to do. It is about joint discussion, what is best for women. Because many of us are located in patriarchal societies where we don't have any voices. And those fundings that come from abroad help us to break these rules and to break this society and to raise our voices, to get the space that is ours. So my thought exactly is how you started your conversation. It is not about building bridges. It may be, there are bridges, but it is not about building walls. It is about, building bridges. And we are, as Women's Funds, we are very much open to building bridges, and we feel that there is so much need, especially considering the current situation with international funding for women's rights, sexual reproductive rights. There is a great, great need.
Great. Irungu, let me give you the last word.
Okay. So here's the thing. I was in a meeting about 4 months ago, and one of the speakers, I think it was the African Grant Makers Affinity Group in New York, and the Carnegie representative at one point said something that I think really for me was the most important thing. One, she said, over the last 30, 40 years that we've been funding in Africa, we have just recently done a study, and we've just discovered that none of the hundreds, maybe even thousands of projects that we've been funding for the last 30 years, none of them have been able to develop their own independent asset base. All of them have either had to come back to us for additional grants in order to continue doing what we want them to do, or they have had to go to other Carnegie-like foundations to transfer the dependency. Not quite those words. But I was left really with a real sense of, I guess, just angst. That actually what we're building has really no sustainable future for some of us. If you are not ATM machines, largely, as European foundations, right? If you're not an ATM machine, and if I'm not just a mechanism for you to spend your money, then let's have a different conversation. And I think there's kind of like 3 things that I think would be useful to do. One is, maybe in Africa, benevolent ethical capital is an interesting way to build this new future. But maybe also crowdfunding and building supporters and building members for the work that we do in Africa would be a complementary, I guess what you'd call resource that we could bring to the foundation community and say that this is what we offer. And in so doing that, you would be left with a partner that is actually transforming their society into a group of active citizens who are not just acting, but they're actually funding things that matter to them. And that seems to be like like an honest, respectful relationship. The second suggestion is this. By all means, open up those administrative budgets and those institutional budgets and give us the capacity to be able to pay staff, to not be late with the rent as we're doing great programming. By all means, do that. But consider that actually what would be a much bigger opportunity is to start looking at co-investment opportunities, both in our countries and in yours, that would leave us with some assets that we would not need you in 5 years' time, and you could move on to others. That would inspire me.
Okay. So, I'm hearing leveraging local, so don't assume you're the only actor, and actually you can use your resources to leverage what's already there and reduce your own role being too big an actor. I think you were saying something about redesign. Let's redesign how we think about development projects. Because a lot of it is great in idea, but in implementation there are design flaws. And another one I think we are saying is let's make it less transactional, more co-investment, more collaborations. It sounds to me perfectly enough for the end of this panel that we're talking about solidarity, more solidarity. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists and our brave volunteer. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to hand over to Eva for the closing out. Thank you.